We're in Porto today to talk about the Metro, which is technically a light rail, but who's keeping track? The system has been a huge success in many ways, finally giving residents a way to avoid traffic and significantly improving certain public spaces. Without a Metro, the quality of life here would be much worse. But it almost didn't happen. It was highly criticized. Porto had to overcome incredibly tough topography while building something that would work for both the suburbs and a city center that is literally a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that wasn't even the hardest challenge. The Metro was involved in what might have been the worst financial decision ever made by any transit agency. The story of the Metro shows us that there are no excuses for not improving transit, and in this video we'll explore why other cities should pay attention and why money isn't always everything. To understand why Porto we needed a metro in the first place. So let's go back in time. The Porto metropolitan area is Portugal's second largest, home to 1.7 million people today. It's an extremely popular tourist destination, especially the city of Porto itself, but the whole area remains a major manufacturing and industrial hub, even with some decline in recent decades. Our journey begins in the 12th century, around the time when iconic landmarks in the city, like the Porto Cathedral and the defensive walls, were being constructed. These features shaped development patterns within the core, creating a network of narrow, winding streets that millions of tourists now flock to see, including myself. However, as the centuries passed, this compact layout wasn't ideal for economic growth. To modernize the city, Porto widened avenues like Rua do Almada in the 18th century, though by today's standards, they're still quite narrow. The 20th century brought massive ring road motorways like the VCI, which made traffic problems much worse. These motorways fueled suburban growth, with the population of the 5 municipalities surrounding Porto growing by over 50% between 1960 and 1980, while the city itself only grew by about 8%. Meanwhile, the rise of tourism and the decline of traditional industries like textiles meant that employment in the region became increasingly concentrated in the service sector, especially in the core of the city. Porto remained the central hub for these activities, no doubt. As a result, every day a large number of people traveled from the suburbs into the city. Unfortunately, most of them had to drive because the public transit system was lacking. Porto did have an iconic tram system, but it was phased out in the 1960s and 1970s in favor of buses for cost reasons. However, as bus traffic became stuck in the ever-growing congestion, reliability dropped, pushing even more people to drive. This led to a vicious cycle where the number of cars on the road surged, overwhelming the motorways and bringing the city center to a standstill. The result? Long commutes, lost productivity, and rising environmental costs. This is Professor Emmanuel Valles, who co-wrote a book about the Metro alongside Professor Pinho. I traveled to Nova University in Lisbon to meet with him. You must work with young people because they are the future, he said. His research is a key part of this video, so we'll hear a lot from both him and Professor Pinho. Back to Porto's traffic. Clearly, the situation was bad for the people, the economy, and the environment. So in 1989, the STCP, Sociedade de Transportes Coletivos do Porto, began looking at solutions. And to no one's surprise, they chose light rail. I know there's some ambiguity around this term, so I specifically mean a semi-metro system, which typically runs tram cars through tunnels or other separated alignments in city centers before emerging onto the surface away from the core. I believe Porto chose this approach for 3 main reasons. First, semi-metros are flexible, which saves money. Porto wanted to preserve its medieval city layout, and a semi-metro system could tunnel where necessary, such as beneath the narrow streets in Porto's historic core, while using cheaper surface alignments in suburban areas with more space. This cost saving was especially crucial because Portugal had only joined the EU in 1986, and at that time, its GDP per capita was only 60% of the EU average. Any money saved, such as by not building a fully underground subway, meant the metro could extend further from the city to better capture radial car traffic. Second, light rail can genuinely improve urban areas. It can inspire the redesign of wide arterial roads into green, walkable boulevards with new public spaces, especially with the new low-floor vehicles that were becoming popular at the time. This transformation greatly improved the quality of life because where metro stations were built, they often planted many trees, making the city more beautiful. But perhaps the biggest reason for choosing light rail was that everyone else was doing it. France made it trendy to revive old transit tram systems in places like Strasbourg and Grenoble, and basically any city that felt like it. Countries like Germany were upgrading their trams by creating rapid transit segments, like tunnels through dense areas, which eventually evolved into the semi-metro concept elsewhere. So light rail wasn't the only choice, but it made a lot of sense. Once the decision was made, Porto went all in. The initial plan called for a semi-metro system with 4 lines running underground across the city center before coming up on the surface away from the core. The network would consist of a north-south line and an east-west line. It was projected to cost between 1 billion euros and 1.3 billion euros, and we'll look closely at this funding later in the video. Construction officially broke ground in May 1999, just about a decade after the idea was first proposed. All things considered, that's not too bad, but just because the light rail system was chosen doesn't mean the journey to completion was easy. The concept that worked on paper didn't necessarily mean it was easy to build. Porto sits on steep granite hills that are over 100 meters high, or 164 F-150s stacked on top of each other. We already know that steep slopes don't mix well with most modes of transport, but the granite itself was actually a major problem. It's not a homogeneous granite. From a geotechnical perspective, it's quite a complex area. The most tragic manifestation of this came in 2001 when part of a tunnel collapsed during construction, bringing down a house above it and killing one of the occupants. The first phase of the project was built in a particularly difficult area, but the clearest symbol of the preservation and geographic challenges faced was undoubtedly the revitalization of the Dom Luís Thoreder Bridge, built in 1886. The bridge connects Porto with Gaia, the city south of the Douro River. Over the years, it carried cars, pedestrians, trams, and buses, but by the 1990s, it had become overwhelmed with vehicle traffic. Note, the MTP later determined that this bridge would also be the best option for a new metro line to cross the Douro River, since it already connected the central areas of both Porto and Gaia. Building a new bridge in this area would have been astronomically expensive and disruptive, so it was never considered a viable option. Adapting the Dom Luís I to carry new 40-ton train cars would require a huge modernization effort, not just adding electrical cables to the bridge deck, but also redesigning the entire flow of vehicle traffic around the area. A big challenge for sure, but Porto did it anyway. 11.6 million euros were invested in revitalizing the bridge, which involved replacing over 60% of the iron on the upper deck. The new design removed road traffic entirely from the upper deck, leaving only the metro and pedestrians to cross. This transformation created an incredible walkable connection between Porto and Gaia, which has become one of the city's defining features today. Private cars were eventually banned from the bridge altogether, though Porto did spend 4 million euros to build a nearby Infant bridge to ease some of the car traffic. This project stands as a preservation masterclass and is a refreshing contrast to when decision makers claim it's too risky or difficult to do something like reactivate an old train line. We're actually a bit out of order here because the bridge rehabilitation was completed in 2005, but the first part of the metro opened in 2002. However, I think the specific order of events matters less than the outcome. By 2006, Porto had successfully launched its ambitious initial network, and people loved it, or at least loved it enough to use it. Ridership more than doubled from the year before, and the system continues to break records year after year, with 79 million trips in 2023. I think that's remarkable. One particularly heartening finding was that the Metro's typical rider was a single, middle-class woman under the age of 24. I know this from MDP's own surveys, which are admittedly subject to selection bias, but it's still a good sign for the system's safety and accessibility. On any weekday, especially after work, it's absolutely packed. This raises some questions about capacity and route planning, which we'll explore later in the video. To better illustrate all of this, I asked Charlie, one of you amazing subscribers, who has relatives in Porto that regularly use the Metro. One of them studied at UPT and mentioned that you could expect the Metro to arrive within 10 minutes, and that it was definitely better than Lisbon's system. Another relative who grew up and worked in the area agreed that you can reliably reach any destination you need, and not once was he late for work. He also pointed out that the Metro helped bridge a significant disconnect between the two sides of the river, giving people on the south side, like him, better access to opportunities in the north. The political influence in the metropolitan area is shaped by decisions made by a group of mayors, referred to as junta. This group is composed of the 17 mayors within the Porto metropolitan area. Decisions that affect multiple municipalities, such as the routing of new metro lines, were undoubtedly influenced by this group. There's a clear conflict of interest. While the mayors are supposed to represent the interests of the entire metropolitan area, they are also accountable to the people who elected them from their specific municipality. Naturally, each mayor wanted the metro to extend into their own municipality, which led to a situation where the metro's coverage was arguably limited. The system was designed more around what these mayors wanted, rather than focusing on the corridors with the highest demand. This issue is particularly evident in Gaia, the municipality with the largest population among the neighboring areas, but which had only a single metro line, at least until the Ruby line opens later this decade. Not a similar situation occurred in Gondomar, a region home to many Porto-bound commuters, but which only received a metro connection in 2011. As a result, the metro has not been particularly effective at reducing car usage. The most immediate impact was to capture passengers from the bus system. This wasn't entirely unexpected, as the metro was intended to consolidate and replace the unreliable bus service. However, a decade later, researchers found that in areas directly served by the metro, the growth rate of car trips slowed, but the total number of trips didn't decrease. In areas not directly served by the metro, the growth in car trips continued largely unaffected. So it's clear that the results have not been ideal, but we'll explore later in the video how the MDP and Professor Pino are addressing these issues with new extensions, like the Ruby line. If you watch my videos regularly, you might have noticed that something is completely missing from this one so far. That's right. The original 1.3 billion euro budget for the project was intended to be around 42% funded by various public sources, including the EU Cohesion Fund, which was designed to help lower-income countries improve their infrastructure. However, by around 2003, as parts of the metro system slowly came online, the MDP approved several extensions such as the airport line. This pushed the total budget from 1.3 billion to just over 2 billion euros. While the expansion was generally a positive development, greatly increasing the system's utility, the subsidies did not increase in line with the larger budget. As a result, instead of the initial 42% in subsidies, public funding eventually only covered about 24% of the costs. Can you guess how the funding gap was filled? It was primarily covered by loans. The MDP ended up financing the larger system with debt. Carrying debt means you have to pay interest, and soon that interest became a significant burden on the MDP's finances. At that time, interest rates were very high, so the MDP had to take out loans not only for operations but also to pay off previous loans. This rapidly increased the debt. Under strong pressure, the MDP had to act. In 2007, they approached Santander Bank and entered into what some media outlets dubbed the worst trade of all time. I think calling it the worst trade is a bit unfair though. In a nutshell, Santander agreed to reduce the MDP's interest rate from 4.76% to 1.76% as long as the 3-month Euribor rate stayed between 2% and 6%. If the Euribor fell outside that range, the MDP would have to pay Santander extra money, calculated as follows: twice the difference between the actual rate and the closest threshold. So for example, if the Euribor dropped to 1%, the MDP would have to pay an additional 2% on top of the original payment. You don't have to be a math expert to realize that this could easily lead to the MDP paying interest rates over 100%. I agree that this swap was not a fair deal, especially when the financial crisis hit in 2009, causing the Euribor to drop to around 0.5%. For every quarter the Euribor stayed below 2%, the MDP was piling on more and more debt, eventually reaching rates above 40%. One reason this swap was agreed upon was the need for liquidity, but when you're in dire need, it's much harder to negotiate better terms. This debt snowball eventually landed in UK courts, and in 2017, both sides agreed to restructure the loan under new, less problematic terms. This whole debacle clearly didn't help the MDP's finances, and they continued to struggle until 2023, when the Portuguese government stepped in and initiated a 99.9% debt equity swap, essentially a buyout that erased the MDP's entire debt load. This was crucial because when a company is burdened by significant debt, even if you can make operational savings, it doesn't help much. The losses are so high that the focus shifts entirely to just servicing the debt, making it difficult to motivate improvements or growth. By wiping the slate clean, the MDP now has a real opportunity to rebuild and move forward. The metro system has gone through its challenges, but I'm still really impressed that it was even built in the first place. What's even more impressive is that, when considering the broader economic, social, and environmental benefits, Valaris and Pinho found that the MDP returned over 9 times its initial €2 billion investment. From this holistic standpoint, it's clearly been profitable. The tricky thing though, and this applies to virtually every transit system in the world, is that none of these externalities can be captured by the operating agency as revenue. If there are positive externalities, they need to be measured very accurately. Otherwise, these benefits should be compensated for. The alternative is to make users pay for them, but if you do that, the externalities decrease significantly. I explained this idea of subsidizing transit and allocative efficiency in one of my videos a while back. Looking ahead, the network is currently being expanded, with the Rose and Ruby lines helping to alleviate capacity issues and address some of the earlier deficiencies we discussed. Professor Pinho is doing everything he can to ensure that these new routes are backed by data. We had to communicate this to local politicians. Some proposals made sense, while others, if implemented, would have been disastrous. My central takeaway from the Metro's entire story is that Porto just got it done. The routes weren't perfect, the train cars are honestly a bit basic, and their finances blew up in spectacular fashion. But just take a look at the areas it's transformed, the number of cars it's taken off the streets, and the sheer volume of people who use it every single day. It's pretty hard to call it anything but a success. I don't think it's possible for a new generation to conceive of the city of Porto without the Metro system. So, that's it.